Lastly, Matthew. Matthew is here on the faculty of at Unitec as an architect and landscape architect, and his research involves developing a methodology which combines both landscape analysis and city design. So more than just a building, a whole urban landscape and structure. And various of Matthew's international engagements have included being involved with the Harvard Graduate School of Design and as a Fulbright senior scholar in 2003 and 4, and and Matthew is also a member of the of Auckland's Urban Design Panel. So, resilience.
Yeah, so thanks, Rod. So, yeah, I guess resilience, I guess another meaning of resilience is it comes from environmental, ecological science, and so in that sense we think of resilience as being something that we apply to like an ecosystem or, something like a lake or a forest. And, we talk about a lake being resilient or a forest having some resilient, being healthy. And so I think a lot of people maybe there's a sort of a problem. Okay, what's the health of an ecosystem got to do with the health of a city, and trying to make that link, and I think that's where some really interesting research and work is really happening around the world at the moment. And I'm going to use New York again as an example. A recent initiative by Bloomberg and various officials and agencies in New York is really looking to reinvent the city, and they've got this fantastic program which comes under various titles, but the Blue Network, the other one is Water as the Fifth Borough, and they're really seeing water, the stuff that's actually surrounding New York, as being this new city. And it's a fantastic concept that really brings that whole resilience kind of notion in, because if the water's the city, I mean we don't tip garbage on our city streets, so we're not going to tip garbage into the water. We're going to try and clean it before it gets to the water. We're going to try and do something with it. The water becomes this connective tissue. So rather than streets, we've got ferries. And of course with sea level rise, climate change, water's going to be a big issue in New York. And so again, by thinking of the water as being part of the city, you can start actually addressing all those issues of making New York a resilient city. And I think so I think there's all the environmental stuff, which is great, but what they're trying to do, even better than that, is they're really trying to reinvent New York as being a city for the 21st century. I mean, New York has been, it really is a capital of the 20th century. The skyscraper, the park, these are all fantastic urban inventions. And we've all, they're spread all around the world. And all the new cities in India, new cities in China are obviously following that model. And now New York's saying, well, actually, there's this other thing. There's the environment. And connecting to the environment, connecting to the landscape, connecting to ecology, making those things resilient, making those things healthy, making those things part of the city is what the city of the 21st century has to be. And it's fantastic seeing New York leading that example. And I guess we'll talk a little bit further, but I mean that's to me is a really a great link to Auckland, because Auckland is a water city. I mean it's a water city par excellence. It's surrounded by water. It's got water and all sorts of types, So I think we can really learn from some of those initiatives, especially in New York, and thinking about how water can become part of our resilient city.
Well, let's actually just key off that central idea that New York's trying to reinvent itself as a 21st century city. If we look out into the middle of this century, to 2050, what will be, do we think, some of the huge shifts in the way that cities might organise themselves or run themselves? I offer that as an open question.
Just to maybe go back one step, 2050 I think is 39 years. So if you go back, that's 1972. And New York, I mean, you look at, say, Bloomberg, I mean, he founded his business in the late 60s, no, early 70s.
No, I would think only early 80s.
Early 80s, right?
So barely 30 years in
so
business.
After the end of the sort of rag trade and the whole, the New York economy had fallen, and so that sort of entrepreneurial financial industry that built up Bloomberg and others has given them the kind of opportunity to speculate on the future. So I mean, I think it's really tricky to disconnect the idea that you were talking about, Rod, of the intersection of ideas and people with the idea of sort of environmental intervention. And I think in Auckland we need to kind of perhaps keep in mind that you need, or in cities generally, that you need those things to happen together.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. I mean, I think we all know the technology of fixing up the environment.
Yeah. You just need money for that.
Yeah, it's the regime. It's a political regime, which is, I guess,
so
money and willpower.
Money and willpower.
And obviously imagination and desire and all of that too. But so if you go back, and if you go back to 19, so what you could speculate, coming back to the question, 2050, I'd simply, and thinking about that, imagine that we will see a similar. I mean, New York could tank again before 2050. And I did read, just as a little, there's a book called Aerotopia, which proposes that what will happen is that the great cities will be built around huge airports. And
which is what we're thinking in Auckland, isn't it? That Mangere is going to be the next city.
So what about that?
Yes.
The biggest bloody airport on the planet. We could get out there and get going on that now.
I think it's Dubai. But can I just push back on one point, as in part of what you said there? It was about the environmental challenges, and I think you were saying that we kind of know what to do. It's just a matter of money and willpower. But do we actually know what to do?
Yes. So I don't mean to be glib about that.
Because if we were thinking about how energy is produced, maybe it's produced very locally, maybe it's and totally renewable, maybe the technology is not there yet. And if that's one direction energy goes, then that's a huge transition, that's a polite word for it, from massive generation stations and reticulation. I'll give you an example where, again, I'm not going to constantly come back to Christchurch. I'm going to refer to other centres in New Zealand too. But one of the things that surprised me about the sort of discussion in Christchurch is how people I thought of as being very conservative, that I know there, are actually now being very radical. So a very conservative property advisor runs the local office of one of the big international firms, is talking about not green roofs, but vertical farming. He wants to farm up the side of buildings. Well, so I think that's brilliant. It'll reconnect Christchurch with its cows. Fantastic. No, I'm not sure about the cows vertically, but anyway, but the point is, how big are those environmental challenges, and how big does that shift in technology and infrastructure have to be over the next 40 years? And if it's really big, how do old cities that haven't had an earthquake retrofit themselves?
Energy has got to be the big issue going forward. I mean, population growth in cities is extraordinary. We're experiencing a microcosm of that in Auckland and New Zealand as well, a very desirable place to live. But energy and cities currently take a lot from our environment. They take and they don't give back a lot. And I think, there are places around the world, and a lot of German cities and Swedish cities, have really understood that idea of cities which use and the waste is then converted into energy. And in Hammarby, for instance, in Sweden, it's just extraordinary, converting, CO2 and methane and ethanol, driving the cities. And even the Mangere treatment plant in Auckland creates its energy of its own through the ethanol and the methane gas. So I think, that is the future, is actually how do buildings give back. And there's a wonderful lady in America, Janine Benelus, who talks about biomimicry and how we can learn from nature about, nature is probably the most resilient thing we've ever had in the world, in the universe, and I think that we can learn a lot of information from how nature has evolved and innovation and evolution. So I think that energy is the big issue for us going forward.
Any others on people's minds?
Well, just to pick up on that, I think that's, nothing I disagree with. The problem is our imaginations. In a funny way, what you're saying really about Christchurch is the earthquake has forced them to actually open their minds to a whole bunch of different things. But for some reason in Auckland, while we think we can't make that step, so we talk about, this is the road, putting in another road from Puhoi to Wellsford, so which will basically open up that for subdivisions, etc. We can't think what Auckland could be like in the way that you are talking about, or you, Matthew. I mean, what is it about us that can't allow us to think really creatively? We all know when we get in our car, we just wish there was a few people get in other cars, in a way. The big number one issue is transport, yet we still can't
get a public.
I mean, I think about, we were saying that 50 years ago. 50 years ago, so it's actually 60 years ago really, but 60 years ago we pulled up our tram lines. So now is the time when we want to think 50 years in advance and sort of think, well, where are we going to be? And my feeling is that we probably want to put the tram lines back again now, so that we could, in 50 years' time they'll go, in 2011 they had the foresight to put the tram lines back.
That's part of the equation, because the tram isn't seductive like the car was. I mean, the car was a very sexy idea. It was all about the individual. I mean, there's such romance in that, and so somehow we have to figure out how to reinvent it and make it, desirable in some way that people want to do. I mean, people are going to, I think, hang on to their cars as long as they can.
But trams are sort of, I mean, you know better than I do, but trams do have that sort of allure that maybe a bus doesn't, or even a train. And if you go to Melbourne, one of the things about it being the easiest city to live in, or whatever they define it as, is about their tram line. And I think who was telling me that the reason they still have their tram line was that they had a very crusty mayor, I think, in the 1950s, and when they came to pull it up, he was ex-army, ex-Second World War army. He said, "No, we're going to keep them." God, I just wish we had one of those.
Yeah. It is kind of pretty important that this, I mean, as everyone is aware, this debate about density and the metropolitan urban limits, not to sort of skew into that, is pretty fundamental in Auckland at the moment. I mean,
I think that's the big issue.
If you read the MBR, you get Owen McShane
saying build.
Saying, and I quote here, not that I'm trying to, but can anyone imagine skilled immigrants being attracted to Auckland because it has trains, pavements, congestion, and high-density slabs? This is what most people want to leave behind. Well, I think if you read much about cities, people do want trains. Other people, density, high-rise slabs is an emotive way of describing density. But there is a pretty major sort of ideological battle being waged in the out there on this topic. And I don't know, I'm no expert in this, but I don't hear much pushback. I mean, McShane makes the point that the reason why Auckland has spread is that people chose to live on the periphery. So that's his proposition, is it's not happened for any other reason than by choice people did it. Now, I don't know what other choice they had.
Well, I think it's the motorway.
Yeah.
Motorway building, isn't it, in the 60s was the thing.
It was about the fact that New Zealand was an incredibly cheap place to live in the 50s and 60s. You could afford to own land, you could afford to own a house, and you had the luxury of that for very little money. And our currency was worth something, and over time that's been eroded. So we've got the devaluation of what our dollar buys us, the increase of costs. I think we've been forced to reconsider the whole notion of living in that with so much space around us, and that those sort of things are actually going to be forced upon us anyway. So.